I have an announcement to make, Andrew said, tapping his wineglass with a spoon. The conversation around my parents' crowded dinner table quieted as everyone turned toward my husband of 7 years. I watched his face carefully, noting the slight tremor in his hand, the way his eyes darted toward my sister Jenna, before settling somewhere above everyone's heads. My heart beat steadily, betraying none of the knowledge I'd been carrying for months. Vivian and I are getting divorced, he continued, his voice growing firmer. I hadn't planned to announce it this way, but since everyone's together... My mother gasped. Aunt Patricia placed a hand over her heart. My father's bushy eyebrows drew together in confusion. There's more, Andrew added, reaching across the table to take Jenna's hand. Jenna and I have fallen in love. We've been trying to fight it for years, but sometimes love chooses you. The shocked silence that followed was broken only by my mother's whispered, "Oh my God." All eyes turned to me, awaiting the inevitable breakdown, tears, screaming, perhaps the throwing of my mother's good china. Instead, I nodded calmly and said, "Please, everyone, check your emails right now." I'm Vivian Hayes, 32 years old, currently employed as a digital forensics specialist for a cybersecurity firm in Seattle. My job involves reconstructing digital evidence, tracking electronic footprints, and documenting digital patterns of behavior. I'm good at what I do, methodical, thorough, and patient. What I wanted was simple, a loving marriage built on honesty and mutual respect. Standing in my way were my husband Andrew and my younger sister Jenna, who had apparently decided that their happiness was worth sacrificing mine. The injustice wasn't just their affair, it was the elaborate deception that accompanied it. The lies told not just to me but to our entire family. The rewriting of our shared history to justify their betrayal. The assumption that I would play the role of blindsided victim in their carefully constructed narrative. Emails? Andrew asked, confusion flickering across his face. What emails? I sent them just before dinner, I replied, pulling out my own phone. Everyone should have received them by now. Around the table, family members hesitantly reached for their phones. My cousin David was the first to open his email, his eyes widening as he scrolled through the contents. My mother followed, her hand flying to her mouth as she gasped for the second time that evening. What have you done? Jenna hissed, her face paling as she grabbed her own phone. Andrew looked increasingly uneasy, glancing between me and his still unopened email. Vivian, whatever this is... It's just documentation, I said evenly. Something I'm particularly good at. As more family members opened their emails, the expressions around the table transformed from shock at the announcement to something darker, disapproval, anger, and disappointment directed not at me, but at Andrew and Jenna. What none of them realized yet was that the emails they were reading contained only a fraction of the evidence I had compiled. The full depth of the betrayal was far worse than anyone at this table, except perhaps Andrew and Jenna, could possibly imagine. Andrew and I met during a charity fundraiser for the Seattle Children's Hospital 8 years ago. He was a pediatric anesthesiologist, dedicated and compassionate. I was there representing my company, which had donated cybersecurity services to the hospital. Our connection was immediate and intense. Within a year, we were married in a small ceremony in my parents' backyard. Those early years were beautiful. We bought a craftsman bungalow in Queen Anne and spent weekends renovating it together. Andrew's work schedule was demanding, but he'd always make time for us. Surprise weekend getaways, cooking elaborate Sunday breakfasts, leaving little notes in my laptop bag. I'd never felt more secure or more loved. Jenna had always been the restless one in our family, dropping out of college twice, moving between cities, and changing careers with dizzying frequency. When she moved back to Seattle 3 years ago after another failed attempt at finding herself in Denver, I was the one who suggested she stay with us until she found her footing. Andrew was hesitant at first. Are you sure? It might change our dynamic, he said. She's my sister, I replied. Family helps family. What was meant to be a 2-month stay stretched into 6. Jenna quickly found a job at a local art gallery, but claimed she couldn't afford Seattle's rental prices. I didn't mind. I'd always wanted to be closer to my sister, and her presence seemed to fill a gap I hadn't realized existed in our home. Looking back, I see the warning signs I missed. How Andrew began working later shifts, how Jenna would run errands that took hours longer than they should have, how they developed inside jokes I wasn't part of, the occasional tension that would fill a room when I entered, as if I'd interrupted something. "You two seem to get along well," my mother commented during a family barbecue, watching Andrew help Jenna set up a badminton net. "Why wouldn't they?" I'd replied, genuinely puzzled. Mom shrugged. "Some men don't get along with their in-laws, you're lucky." I was lucky, I thought. My husband and sister had become friends. Our house felt more alive with Jenna's energy. If Andrew sometimes seemed distant, I attributed it to work stress. If Jenna occasionally watched him with a strange intensity, I dismissed it as my imagination. Even after Jenna finally moved into her own apartment, she remained a constant presence in our lives. Sunday dinners, impromptu movie nights, calls for help with household repairs that apparently couldn't wait until I got home from work. "You're too trusting," my friend Heather told me once after witnessing Jenna call Andrew for the third time during our lunch. "I wouldn't let my sister get that comfortable with my husband." I had laughed it off. Jenna's just needy. Besides, it's Andrew. The implication was clear. Andrew would never betray me. He was too honest, too devoted, too good. If I occasionally caught him looking at an incoming text and quickly putting his phone away, I told myself not to be paranoid. If he and Jenna sometimes fell silent when I entered a room, I assured myself it was coincidence. Trust, after all, was the foundation of our marriage. The discovery came by accident, as these things often do. 6 months ago, I was using Andrew's laptop to order takeout while he was at work. When I opened the browser, it automatically restored his previous session, including his email. I wasn't looking for anything. I had no suspicions compelling me to snoop. But there it was, a series of messages between Andrew and Jenna, explicit and unambiguous. "Last night was amazing," Jenna had written. "I can't stop thinking about you." "We need to be more careful," Andrew replied. "I don't want to hurt Viv." I read through the entire thread with a strange detachment, as if I were examining evidence for a case at work rather than witnessing the collapse of my marriage. The emails stretched back over 2 years, 2 years of deception, carrying on right under my nose. I closed the laptop without ordering dinner. When Andrew came home that night, I searched his face for signs of the stranger I'd discovered. Some indication that the man who kissed my forehead and asked about my day was the same one who had written those messages to my sister. But he looked exactly the same. "You okay?" he asked, noticing my quietness. "Rough day at work?" "Just tired," I replied, watching him carefully. How easily the lie came to him, how comfortably he moved through our home, our life, while maintaining this secret. Over the next few days, I found myself oscillating between numbness and devastating pain. I would wake up at 3 a.m., heart racing, wondering how I had missed the signs. During daylight hours, I functioned on autopilot, going to work, making dinner, engaging in conversations that now felt scripted and hollow. I didn't confront them immediately. A part of me hoped there was an explanation, something that would make sense of the incomprehensible. Perhaps the emails were just fantasy, never acted upon. Perhaps Andrew had been manipulated somehow. Perhaps I had misunderstood the context. But professional habits die hard. I began documenting, almost unconsciously at first. I noted when Andrew claimed to be working late, but his location showed elsewhere. I logged accidental encounters between him and Jenna that seemed too frequent to be coincidence. I matched credit card statements with hotel bookings and restaurant charges. The evidence mounted, irrefutable and heartbreaking. Not only were they having an affair, but they were extraordinarily careless about it, as if they didn't expect me to notice, or perhaps didn't care if I did. 2 weeks after my initial discovery, I found myself sitting in my car outside an upscale hotel downtown, watching Andrew and Jenna enter together. They were laughing, his hand resting intimately on the small of her back. I took photos mechanically, adding them to my growing file. That night, Andrew came home late, claiming an emergency surgery had kept him at the hospital. I nodded, served him reheated dinner, and listened to his elaborate fiction about a child with a ruptured appendix. "You look exhausted," I said, studying the faint smudge of lipstick on his collar, Jenna's shade. "It was intense," he agreed, reaching for my hand across the table. "But I'm home now." The tenderness of the gesture nearly broke me. In that moment, I realized I was living with a perfect stranger, someone capable of looking me in the eye while constructing an alternate reality. The man I had married, the sister I had grown up with, neither existed as I had believed. I withdrew my hand gently. "You should get some rest." That night, as Andrew slept beside me, I made my decision. I wouldn't confront them yet. I wouldn't give them the satisfaction of my tears or rage. I would continue gathering evidence, building my case methodically and thoroughly. And when the time came to reveal what I knew, it wouldn't be in private, where they could manage the narrative. It would be public, irrefutable, and completely on my terms. For the next 2 months, I lived a double life. During the day, I was Vivian Hayes, devoted wife and loving sister. I attended family gatherings, maintained our home, and continued the routines of our marriage with robotic precision. At night, I became a detective in my own life, meticulously documenting the web of lies that surrounded me. The more I uncovered, the more elaborate their deception proved to be. They had created a shared digital calendar with coded entries to coordinate their meetings. They had a joint credit card I never knew about, used exclusively for their rendezvous. They had even discussed future plans, vacations they would take, a house they hoped to buy, once they figured out the Vivian situation. My first attempt at confrontation came after 3 months of surveillance. I approached it strategically, choosing a moment when Andrew was vulnerable, tired after a long shift, slightly mellowed by a glass of wine. "I think we should talk about Jenna," I said casually as we sat on the porch swing one evening. His body tensed infinitesimally. "What about her?" "I've noticed you two seem close." Andrew laughed, the sound slightly forced. "She's your sister. Of course we're close." "No, I mean really close, Andrew." I held his gaze steadily. "Is there something you want to tell me?" For a moment, I thought he might confess. Something flickered in his eyes, recognition, perhaps even guilt. Then his expression hardened. "I don't know what you're suggesting, but I don't appreciate it," he said coolly. "Jenna is family. If you're feeling insecure about something, that's on you." The swift denial and redirection, casting me as the irrational, jealous wife, was so smooth it almost made me doubt my own evidence. Almost. My next approach was more direct. I left browser windows open to hotel confirmations, placed my documented timeline where he might accidentally discover it. Each time, Andrew found ways to explain away the evidence or simply ignored it completely. Meanwhile, Jenna launched her own counteroffensive. She began calling me more frequently, suggesting sister activities with artificial enthusiasm. She introduced me to single men at gallery events, commenting how "Andrew and I both think you work too much. You should date more." The casual cruelty of trying to set me up while sleeping with my husband was breathtaking. The most painful revelation came from my mother, who innocently mentioned that Jenna had been helping Andrew plan something special for your anniversary. "She's been so secretive about it," Mom said. "But she mentioned they've been working on the surprise for months." Our anniversary was still 4 months away. The idea that they were using it as cover for their meetings, involving my own mother in their fiction, crystallized something inside me. This wasn't just an affair. It was a systematic campaign to manipulate everyone around us. I decided to force the issue. One evening, I deliberately left evidence of their affair, hotel receipts, screenshots of their messages, on the kitchen counter where Andrew would find them. When he came home, I waited in the living room, prepared for the confrontation that would finally bring everything into the open. Hours passed. Finally, Andrew entered, his expression grave. "We need to talk," he said, sitting across from me. "Yes, we do," I agreed, feeling a strange sense of relief that the charade was ending. "I found something disturbing," he continued, placing a folder on the coffee table between us. I reached for it, expecting to see the evidence I had left for him. Instead, I found printed emails between me and a colleague from work, innocent messages discussing a project, edited to appear romantic and incriminating. "I know about David," Andrew said, his voice tight with manufactured pain. "How long has this been going on?" The moment was so surreal I almost laughed. He had fabricated evidence of an affair to accuse me, a perfect distraction from his own betrayal. "There's nothing going on with David," I said calmly. "Those messages are about work, and you know it." "They seem pretty intimate to me," he countered. "All those late nights at the office, it makes sense now." I realized with startling clarity that he wasn't just deflecting. He was setting up his justification, creating a narrative where my imagined infidelity had driven him into Jenna's arms. The calculated nature of it chilled me to the bone. "I think we should take some time apart," he said, reaching for my hand with practiced concern. "This isn't healthy for either of us." In that moment, I understood. Direct confrontation would never work. Andrew and Jenna had invested too much in their version of reality. They would deny, deflect, and distort the truth until their fiction became the accepted narrative. Time apart might be good, I agreed, watching relief flood his features. He hadn't expected me to concede so easily. "I'm glad you understand," he said, squeezing my hand. "This isn't about blame. Sometimes people just grow apart." His practiced sympathy was almost admirable. I wondered how many times he'd rehearsed this conversation with Jenna, perfecting his concerned expression in her bathroom mirror. "Nah, I'll stay with Jenna while we figure things out," he continued. "She offered her guest room when I told her about the situation." Of course she had. I nodded, playing my assigned role in their script while mentally shifting to a new phase of my investigation. If Andrew thought my acquiescence meant surrender, he was gravely mistaken. The following week, as Andrew moved some of his things to Jenna's apartment, I took a personal day from work. While they believed I was at the office, I visited a private investigator recommended by a colleague. Douglas Parker specialized in infidelity cases and had testified in hundreds of divorce proceedings. "I'm not looking to hire you," I explained, spreading my evidence across his desk. "I need a professional assessment of what I've gathered and advice on what else I might need." Douglas reviewed my documentation with impressed surprise. "Most clients come to me with suspicions. You've brought a complete case file." "It's what I do for a living," I replied. "Just not usually in my personal life." He confirmed what I already suspected. My evidence was compelling, but could potentially be explained away in isolation. He recommended additional documentation, financial records showing patterns of deception, witness statements from hotel staff, and most importantly, evidence of their intent to mislead rather than just the affair itself. "Intent is powerful in divorce proceedings," he advised. "If you can prove they deliberately plan to deceive you and others, it strengthens your position considerably." I left his office with renewed purpose and a list of resources. Over the next month, I expanded my investigation beyond just documenting the affair. I uncovered financial deceptions I hadn't previously detected. Andrew had been diverting money from our joint savings to a private account for nearly a year. Jenna had charged expenses to my credit card on multiple occasions when I had loaned it to her for emergencies. The most stunning discovery came through Andrew's cloud storage, which automatically backed up his text messages. I found conversations between him and Jenna discussing me in cruel, dismissive terms, mocking my trust, planning how they would present their relationship to our family after the inevitable divorce. "She's so caught up in her work, she hasn't noticed a thing," Andrew had written. "We could probably have sex on the kitchen counter while she's typing away in the next room." "She'll probably thank us for making the decision for her," Jenna replied. "She never really knew how to be a proper wife anyway." Reading their casual cruelty transformed something within me. The numbness that had protected me gave way to a cold, clarifying anger. This wasn't just betrayal. It was systematic emotional abuse, a coordinated effort to undermine my reality while preserving their self-image. I began preparing for the endgame. Divorce was inevitable, but it would happen on my terms, not theirs. I consulted with Diana Wright, the most respected divorce attorney in Seattle, who reviewed my evidence with clinical precision. "This is exceptional documentation," she said. "Most clients bring me tissues and accusations. You've brought receipts, literal and figurative." "What should I expect?" I asked. "With what you've provided. A favorable settlement, certainly, but Washington is a no-fault state. The courts won't punish them for the affair itself." "I'm not looking for legal punishment," I clarified. "I want the truth recognized. I want their narrative dismantled." Diana studied me thoughtfully. "The court of public opinion can be more punishing than any legal judgment. If that's your aim, you need to consider carefully how and when you present this evidence." Her words crystallized my approach. Andrew and Jenna had orchestrated a public fiction. The appropriate response was public truth, delivered in a way they couldn't control or rewrite. As I left Diana's office, my phone buzzed with a text from my mother. "Family dinner at our house this Sunday, your father's birthday. Andrew and Jenna both confirmed. Please come, don't make it awkward." The perfect stage had presented itself. All the players would be gathered, expecting to manage the narrative of my failing marriage and their blossoming love. They had no idea I was no longer following their script. I spent the next 3 days meticulously preparing my presentation. Each email was tailored to its recipient, containing only the information relevant to them. For my father, evidence of how Andrew had borrowed money from him, while simultaneously diverting funds to his secret account. For my mother, proof of how Jenna had used her to establish alibis. For my aunts and cousins, documentation of the specific lies told to each of them. The final touch was a master email to myself that contained everything: the complete timeline, all evidence, and a detailed account of my discovery process. This would be my reference during the inevitable chaos that would follow my revelation. On Sunday morning, I woke with strange serenity. I dressed carefully in a simple blue dress that Andrew had always complimented. I styled my hair, applied light makeup, and adorned myself with the pearl earrings my grandmother had left me, a talisman of her strength that I desperately needed. As I prepared to leave, my phone chimed with a text from Jenna. "Just checking you're coming tonight. Dad would be heartbroken if you didn't show. We're all family, after all." The casual audacity nearly broke my composure. I took a deep breath, reminding myself that in a few hours, their fiction would collapse under the weight of irrefutable evidence. I arrived at my parents' home precisely on time, bearing a homemade cake and a carefully wrapped gift for my father. The familiar sounds of family gathering enveloped me as I stepped inside. Laughter from the living room, the clatter of dishes in the kitchen, the low murmur of sports commentary from the television. Andrew and Jenna were already there, seated side by side on the sofa. They had maintained a pretense of casual friendship in family settings, but now, with the truth of their relationship about to be unveiled, they sat slightly closer than before, testing the waters of their public couplehood. "Vivian," my mother greeted me with a tight hug. "I'm so glad you came. This means so much to your father." I returned her embrace, breathing in her familiar perfume, wondering how she would look at me after reading my email, if she would recognize the strength it had taken to endure these months of deception. The dinner proceeded with excruciating normalcy. We ate my mother's pot roast and discussed safe topics: the weather, my cousin's new baby, my father's retirement plans. I participated mechanically, watching Andrew and Jenna exchange glances across the table, clearly anticipating the moment they had planned. As dessert was served, Andrew cleared his throat and tapped his glass. I felt a chill of déjà vu, recognizing the gesture from countless family gatherings when he'd made announcements: job promotions, our engagement, the purchase of our home. Moments that had once filled me with pride now revealed as steps in a relationship built on quicksand. What I hadn't anticipated was a last-minute complication. Just as Andrew began to speak, my phone buzzed with an alert from my email scheduling system. Delivery failed, server error. A quick check confirmed my worst fear. The carefully timed emails had not been sent. While Andrew launched into his prepared speech about difficult decisions and unexpected love, I frantically tried to resend the emails. The server response was clear. Temporary outage, estimated recovery time unknown. I felt a moment of pure panic. My entire plan hinged on those emails arriving simultaneously with Andrew's announcement. Without them, I would indeed be cast as the blindsided, pitiful wife they expected me to be. Andrew was reaching the climax of his speech, his hand now openly holding Jenna's. My family watched with expressions ranging from shock to discomfort to pity, exactly the reaction they had anticipated. I had seconds to decide. Walk out in apparent defeat? Confront them without my evidence? Neither option was acceptable. As Andrew uttered the words, "Jenna and I have fallen in love," I realized there was a third option. I had brought my laptop as backup. All the evidence was there, organized and ready. With calm determination, I opened it under the table and navigated to my email program. As Andrew finished speaking and all eyes turned expectantly toward me, I pressed send on a single email to everyone present, with all attachments included. "Please, everyone," I said into the stunned silence, "check your emails right now." The choreography of the next few moments was almost beautiful in its precision. Phones chimed in succession around the table as my email arrived. Confused glances were exchanged before, one by one, family members opened the message. "I've prepared some additional context for Andrew's announcement," I explained calmly, watching Andrew's confident smile falter. "Just some documentation I thought everyone should have." My father was the first to react, his face darkening as he scrolled through his phone. My cousin David whispered, "Holy shit," under his breath. My mother set her phone down with trembling hands, looking between Jenna and me with dawning horror. "What is this?" Andrew demanded, reaching for his own phone. "It's the truth," I replied simply. "Everything I've discovered over the past 6 months, organized for clarity, hotel receipts, text messages, financial records, the complete history of your relationship with my sister." Jenna lunged for her phone, her face draining of color as she opened the email. "These are private conversations. You had no right—" "They're conversations about me," I corrected. "About how to deceive me. About how pathetic and oblivious I am. I particularly enjoyed the exchange where you discussed whether to tell me before or after Christmas, and decided that ruining her holiday would be cruel." Andrew was frantically scrolling through the evidence, his planned narrative of star-crossed lovers disintegrating with each swipe. "This is invasion of privacy," he sputtered. "You can't just—" "Actually, I can," I interrupted. "Washington is a one-party consent state for recordings. Our shared accounts were, well, shared. And most of this information was gathered from devices and accounts you left open, often in our home." The room had fallen into stunned silence, broken only by the occasional gasp as someone reached a particularly damning piece of evidence. "You planned to announce this tonight," I continued, my voice steady. "You choreographed this moment to control the narrative. The reluctant lovers, the difficult decision, the clean break. You just didn't expect me to have a narrative of my own." My mother found her voice first. "Jenna, how could you do this to your sister?" It was happening, the shift in perception I had worked for months to achieve. The rewriting of their carefully constructed fiction. Andrew attempted damage control, his doctor's authority surfacing as he tried to regain command of the situation. "This is clearly Vivian's way of processing a difficult transition," he said, adopting a clinical tone. "She's created this elaborate—" "Stop talking, Andrew," my father interrupted, his voice ice-cold. "My daughter doesn't fabricate evidence. It's her literal profession." Jenna shifted to tears, her go-to strategy when confronted. "I never meant to hurt anyone," she sobbed. "It just happened. You can't control who you fall in love with. According to your texts, my cousin David interjected, holding up his phone, you've been planning this for over 2 years. That's not just happening. The chorus of condemnation grew as more family members processed what they were reading. Aunt Patricia was comforting my mother, who couldn't stop staring at Jenna as if seeing a stranger. Uncle James was asking Andrew pointed questions about financial discrepancies mentioned in the emails. I remained silent, watching the natural consequences unfold. After months of documentation, analysis, and preparation, there was nothing more I needed to say. The evidence spoke for itself, clear and irrefutable. I gathered my purse and stood. I should go, I said quietly. Dad, I'm sorry about your birthday dinner. My father stood immediately. I'll walk you out. Outside, he hugged me fiercely. I had no idea what you've been going through, he said, his voice rough with emotion. Why didn't you tell us sooner? I needed to understand it first, I explained, and I needed everyone else to understand it too, not just believe me. As I drove away, my phone lit up with messages from family members, expressions of support, shock, and solidarity. I turned it off, welcoming the silence. The next morning, I filed for divorce. Andrew and Jenna's attempts to control the narrative had collapsed completely, not through dramatic confrontation, but through the methodical presentation of truth. 3 months later, as I signed the final divorce papers, my lawyer asked if I felt satisfied with the outcome. I don't feel satisfaction, I replied honestly, just clarity. I had built a career uncovering digital evidence of human behavior. I never imagined my greatest case would be documenting my own unraveling marriage. But professionals use the tools they have, and in the end, methodical documentation had accomplished what emotional confrontation never could. It had replaced deception with truth. That evening, I packed the last of my belongings and moved into my new apartment overlooking Puget Sound. As the sun set over the water, I deleted the investigation files from my computer, the final step in a process that had consumed nearly a year of my life. Tomorrow would be the first page of a new chapter, one written entirely in my own hand. You're not even her real granddaughter, my father spat, his face contorted with rage. Only blood relatives deserve the family fortune. I stood frozen in Grandmother Eleanor's study, the heavy oak shelves filled with leather-bound classics surrounding us like silent witnesses to his cruelty. My grandmother had been buried only 3 days ago, and already the family was fracturing over her will. What are you talking about? I managed, my voice barely audible over the thundering of my heart. Don't play innocent, Jennifer. Your mother's little secret isn't so secret anymore. He paced the oriental rug, pausing to glare at the formal portrait of grandmother hanging above the fireplace. Eleanor was obsessed with bloodlines. Once the lawyer confirms you've got no Blackwell blood, you'll get nothing. I looked him directly in the eyes, fighting to keep my voice steady. Do you promise to keep your word about this? That only blood relatives deserve grandmother's inheritance? Absolutely, he declared, lifting his chin with the same imperious tilt I'd seen countless times throughout my childhood. I'll make sure the family legacy stays with real Blackwells, not imposters. My name is Jennifer Blackwell. I'm 27 years old, and until 5 minutes ago, I believed Douglas Blackwell was my biological father. Now, standing in my grandmother's Georgian mansion in suburban Philadelphia, I was apparently discovering otherwise. What I wanted was simple, the fair treatment Grandmother Eleanor intended in her will. She had specifically mentioned me, her only granddaughter, during our last conversation about her estate plans. Standing in my way was the man who had always viewed me with thinly veiled contempt, the man whose approval I had spent decades trying to earn unsuccessfully. You can attend the will reading next week if you must, he continued dismissively, but don't expect anything. I've already spoken with Harrison about challenging any provisions that include you. Harrison Mills was my father's longtime friend and our family attorney. The mention of their apparent collusion sent a chill through me. I'll be there, I replied quietly. Grandmother wanted me there. Sentiment, he scoffed. Eleanor always had a blind spot for you. Fortunately, the law cares about facts, not feelings. As he strode from the room, I sank into grandmother's desk chair, running my fingers over the polished walnut surface where she had written countless letters, reviewed business documents, and most recently, finalized her will. My phone buzzed with a text from my mother. We need to talk about your father. Tonight, alone. I stared at the message, unease crawling up my spine. If my father wasn't my biological father, then who was? And how had this secret remained hidden for 27 years? More importantly, why was it surfacing now, just days after grandmother's death and days before her fortune would be distributed? Whatever truth awaited me, one thing was becoming clear. The father I had spent my life trying to please had been harboring resentment far deeper than I had ever realized. Growing up as a Blackwell meant navigating a world of privilege and weighty expectations. The Blackwell fortune, built on pharmaceutical patents and shrewd investments, had sustained 3 generations of the family in considerable luxury. My father, Douglas, was the elder of 2 sons, which automatically positioned him as the presumptive heir to the majority of the Blackwell assets. His younger brother, James, had been the family rebel, brilliant but restless, unwilling to conform to our grandfather's rigid vision of the family legacy. He'd left Philadelphia to pursue medical research in Seattle, returning only occasionally for major family events. My memories of Uncle James were limited but warm. His easy laugh, thoughtful gifts, and the way he'd speak to me as though my opinions mattered. In contrast, my relationship with my father had always been strained. Douglas Blackwell was a man who measured worth in achievements and status. My brothers, Thomas and William, had fulfilled his expectations admirably, Thomas following him into the family business, William excelling in law school. I, however, had disappointed him at every turn. She lacks the Blackwell drive, he'd remarked to my mother when he thought I couldn't hear. Too soft, too unfocused. Despite graduating with honors and establishing a promising career in historical preservation, nothing I accomplished seemed to meet his standard. I'd attributed this perpetual disappointment to sexism or perhaps unrealistic expectations, never imagining there might be a more fundamental reason for his distance. Grandmother Eleanor had been my sanctuary. Unlike my father, she valued my interest in history and art, encouraging me to pursue a path that honored my passions rather than family tradition. During my undergraduate years, I'd visit her estate every Sunday for tea, listening to her stories of family history and her own quiet rebellions against the constraints placed on women of her generation. Remember, Jennifer, she often told me, a Blackwell makes their own path. Her death at 86 had been peaceful, but left an emptiness I was still struggling to navigate. The knowledge that I'd lost my greatest advocate within the family made her absence even more profound. In the days following her funeral, I'd noticed subtle changes in my father's behavior, heightened scrutiny when I interacted with other family members, hushed conversations with Harrison Mills that abruptly ended when I entered a room. I'd dismissed these observations as grief manifesting in different ways, but now they took on a more sinister significance. The last time I'd seen grandmother alive, she'd held my hand with surprising strength and whispered, "Trust your instincts, Jennifer. Not everything is as it appears." At the time, I'd attributed her cryptic words to medication or fatigue. Now I wondered if she'd been trying to prepare me for the storm that was about to break over our family. As I left grandmother's study to meet my mother, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being drawn into a family drama decades in the making, one with roots deeper than I could yet comprehend. My mother was waiting for me at her favorite cafe, tucked away in a quiet corner of the city, where Blackwells were just ordinary people. She looked smaller somehow, her usually impeccable appearance slightly disheveled, eyes shadowed by sleepless nights. "I never wanted you to find out this way," she began without preamble, her fingers nervously turning her wedding band. "Your father, Douglas, shouldn't have told you like that. It was cruel and self-serving." "So it's true?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "He's not my biological father?" She nodded, tears gathering in her eyes. "It's complicated, Jennifer. More complicated than Douglas makes it sound." Over the next hour, my mother unraveled a story that upended everything I thought I knew about my family. She and James, my uncle, had been in love before she met Douglas. They'd been young, passionate, and planning a future together when James received a prestigious research fellowship in Seattle. "We agreed he should go," she explained. "It was an incredible opportunity. We thought we could manage the distance." But the separation had strained their relationship, and during a particularly difficult period, she'd grown close to Douglas, who had always admired her from afar. A moment of vulnerability led to a brief relationship, one she ended when she realized her heart still belonged to James. When I discovered I was pregnant, I was certain it was James's child. The timing aligned perfectly with his last visit home. Her voice trembled. But Douglas insisted the child was his, and James was already engaged to someone else by then. I didn't want to disrupt his new life. Douglas had proposed immediately, presenting their marriage as the honorable solution. Only later did my mother realize that his interest had never been entirely about her. The Blackwell fortune had strict inheritance provisions that favored male heirs with legitimate children. "He needed a wife and children to secure his position," she said bitterly. "And I needed stability for my baby. It seemed like the best option at the time." Years passed and the secret held. James eventually moved back to Philadelphia with his wife, but they remained childless. When his marriage ended in divorce, he threw himself into medical research, becoming increasingly distant from family affairs. "Did James ever know?" I asked. "No," my mother whispered. "I couldn't bear to disrupt his life again. And as the years passed, it seemed crueler to reveal the truth." The revelation left me reeling. Every memory of childhood now required re-examination. My father's coldness, Uncle James's warmth during his rare visits, Grandmother Eleanor's special attention to me. "Why is Douglas revealing this now?" I finally asked. My mother's expression hardened. "Your grandmother's will. He's always been obsessed with the Blackwell fortune, and now he's worried Eleanor might have left you a significant portion. He needs to discredit your claim." "But if I'm not a blood Blackwell?" "That's just it," she interrupted. "You are a Blackwell by blood, just not Douglas's child. You're James's daughter, which makes you Eleanor's granddaughter by blood regardless." The irony was almost too perfect. My father's attempt to cut me out of the inheritance by denying our biological connection might actually strengthen my claim through a different branch of the family tree. "What do I do now?" I asked, feeling adrift in this new reality. My mother reached across the table to clasp my hands. "That depends on what you want, Jennifer. Justice? Acknowledgement? Or simply your fair share of what Eleanor intended for you?" I didn't have an answer yet. The betrayal was too fresh, the implications too vast to process in a single conversation. But as we left the cafe, one certainty crystallized in my mind. I would not allow Douglas Blackwell to rewrite my history for his financial gain. The question was how to prove my true parentage before the will reading, and whether that truth would help or harm my position in the complex web of Blackwell inheritance rules. The next morning, I drove to Uncle James's apartment, heart hammering against my ribs. I had called ahead, keeping my reason vague. Family matters to discuss before the will reading. Now, sitting in his modest living room surrounded by scientific journals and travel mementos, I struggled to find the words to upend his world alongside mine. "You seem troubled, Jennifer," he observed, setting 2 cups of tea on the coffee table. At 58, James Blackwell remained handsome, with the same dark eyes I saw in my mirror every morning. "Is Douglas making things difficult about Eleanor's estate?" "It's more complicated than that," I began, then faltered. How did one ask a man if he might be your biological father? Uncle James, did you and my mother were you ever together? Before she married father? The cup froze halfway to his lips, his expression shifting from surprise to guarded caution. Why would you ask about ancient history now? Because Douglas has informed me that he's not my biological father, and he's using that claim to challenge my place in grandmother's will. James set his cup down with deliberate care. That sounds like Douglas, calculating even in cruelty. He studied my face with new intensity. What has your mother told you? I recounted my mother's revelations about their past relationship, watching his expressions cycle through nostalgia, pain, and something that looked remarkably like hope. I never knew, he said finally. Catherine never told me she was pregnant. By the time I heard about the marriage, it was already done. He leaned forward. Jennifer, are you saying you believe I might be your father? The timing fits, according to Mother, but Douglas is determined to prove I have no Blackwell blood to claim my inheritance. James's expression darkened. Eleanor's will specifically mentions you by name. Douglas can't simply write you out of it. He claims he can challenge any provisions made under false pretenses, namely that grandmother believed me to be his biological daughter. James rose abruptly, pacing the small room. This is absurd. Even if you were not Douglas's biological child, you're still Eleanor's granddaughter if you're my daughter. He stopped, meeting my gaze directly. We need to know for certain. A DNA test would settle this question definitively. The clinical simplicity of his solution both relieved and terrified me. You'd be willing to take one? Without hesitation, he replied. I've always felt a connection to you that I couldn't quite explain. If you are my daughter... His voice caught. Well, let's confirm the facts before we get ahead of ourselves. We arranged for expedited testing that same day, using a private lab that promised results within 72 hours, just enough time before the will reading. As we submitted our samples, a strange combination of dread and anticipation settled in my stomach. Regardless of the outcome, my relationship with both men would be irrevocably altered. While awaiting results, I attempted to gather information about grandmother's will. I contacted her personal attorney, Bernard Walsh, separate from the family lawyer Harrison Mills. I'm afraid I can't discuss the specific provisions before the official reading, Bernard explained when I visited his office. But I can assure you that your grandmother was of sound mind and very clear about her intentions. Did she know? I asked directly. About my biological parentage? Bernard's carefully neutral expression slipped momentarily. I cannot comment on that, but I will say that Eleanor Blackwell was a remarkably perceptive woman who very little escaped her notice. His non-answer told me everything I needed to know. Grandmother had suspected, perhaps even confirmed, that I was James's daughter, not Douglas's. My momentary triumph evaporated when I received a formal letter that evening. Harrison Mills had petitioned the court to delay the will reading pending resolution of identity concerns regarding purported beneficiaries. Douglas was moving faster than anticipated, using his legal connections to buy time while he built his case against me. When I called Bernard to ask about the delay, his secretary informed me he had been suddenly hospitalized with pneumonia and would be unavailable indefinitely. It couldn't be coincidence. Douglas was systematically removing my potential allies and information sources. Without Bernard or the DNA results, I would enter the will reading at a severe disadvantage. That night, my mother called in a panic. Douglas knows you met with James. He's furious. Jennifer, be careful. When Douglas feels threatened, he becomes dangerous. The DNA results arrived via encrypted email 2 days before the rescheduled will reading. With trembling fingers, I opened the document, scanning for the conclusion buried amid scientific terminology. Probability of paternity, 99.99998%. James Blackwell was unquestionably my biological father. I sat back, emotions flooding through me. Vindication, grief for the relationship I never had, anger at the years of deception. The scientific confirmation transformed abstract possibility into concrete reality. Douglas, the man who had coldly rejected me my entire life, was not my father at all. I immediately called James, who received the news with quiet emotion. "I suspected from the moment you asked," he admitted. "You have Catherine's smile, but those eyes, they're Blackwell eyes, my mother's eyes." We agreed to meet before the will reading to discuss our approach. Armed with DNA proof, I finally had leverage against Douglas. Or so I thought. That evening, Harrison Mills requested an urgent meeting at his office. Despite my misgivings, I agreed, curious about this sudden outreach from my father's, no, Douglas's, legal ally. The elegant offices of Mills and Associates signaled old money and discretion. Harrison, silver-haired and impeccably dressed, greeted me with practiced cordiality that didn't reach his eyes. "Jennifer, thank you for coming. I thought we should discuss certain developments before the will reading." "You mean the fact that Douglas isn't my biological father, or that you filed a frivolous petition to delay the reading?" His smile tightened. "Actually, I was referring to the DNA test you and James arranged." My blood ran cold. How could he possibly know about the test? We had been meticulously careful. "Douglas was quite distressed to learn of this independent investigation," Harrison continued. "He asked me to convey a proposal." He slid a document across his desk. It was a waiver agreement relinquishing all claims to Eleanor Blackwell's estate in exchange for a one-time payment of $250,000. "This is absurd," I said, pushing it back. "Grandmother specifically included me in her will." "Yes, under the presumption you were Douglas's daughter. Now that we know otherwise..." "Now we know I'm James's daughter, which makes me even more legitimately Eleanor's granddaughter than if I were Douglas's," I interrupted. "Blood relatives deserve the family fortune, isn't that what Douglas always says?" Harrison's expression shifted. "There are complexities you're unaware of, Jennifer. Legal nuances regarding the Blackwell Trust that supersede simple biology." "What complexities?" "I'm not at liberty to discuss details before the reading, but I strongly advise you to consider this offer. Douglas is prepared to be quite aggressive in defending the family interests." The veiled threat hung between us. I left without signing, more determined than ever to stand my ground, but deeply unsettled by Harrison's confidence despite our seemingly ironclad DNA evidence. The next morning brought the revelation that shattered my understanding of the entire situation. James called, his voice tight with controlled fury. "Jennifer, I've just received some disturbing information from an old family friend, a nurse who worked with my father decades ago." He paused. "Douglas isn't biologically a Blackwell." "What?" The room seemed to tilt around me. Apparently, my parents adopted Douglas as an infant after my mother had several miscarriages. When she unexpectedly became pregnant with me years later, they decided to keep the adoption quiet, not wanting Douglas to feel like less than their son. The implications hit me like a physical blow. If Douglas wasn't a blood Blackwell, then by his own logic. "Does Douglas know?" I managed. "I don't think so. Our parents took the secret to their graves. But Eleanor might have known. She and my mother were extremely close." "That's why Harrison was so confident," I breathed. "There must be something in the will or trust documents specifying blood relations." "Exactly. I've been reviewing copies of the original Blackwell Trust. There's a specific clause requiring direct bloodline descent for principal inheritance. Douglas would have been protected by his legal adoption, but by making this about biological legitimacy, he's potentially disqualified himself." The irony was almost too perfect. Douglas's attempt to disinherit me by questioning my biological connection to the Blackwell line could backfire catastrophically if his own adoption came to light. "What do we do with this information?" I asked. James was quiet for a moment. "That depends on what you want, Jennifer. What Douglas deserves and what's right for our family might be different things." I considered his words carefully. "I think," I said slowly, that people who insist on blood purity should be held to their own standards, don't you? The morning of the will reading dawned crisp and clear, Philadelphia's autumn painting the trees in brilliant hues outside grandmother's mansion where the family had gathered. I arrived early with James, our shared secret, a fragile weapon we weren't yet certain how to deploy. Harrison Mills presided from the head of the dining table, leather portfolio open before him, while various Blackwell relatives filled the high-backed chairs. Douglas sat directly opposite me, his posture radiating confidence, flanked by my brothers, who looked uncomfortable but determined to support their father. "Before we begin," Harrison announced, "I must address a delicate matter regarding succession eligibility." Douglas straightened, shooting me a triumphant glance. "It has come to our attention that certain beneficiaries named in Eleanor Blackwell's will may not qualify under the bloodline provisions of the original Blackwell Family Trust." My mother, seated beside me, gripped my hand beneath the table. Harrison continued, "As you know, Eleanor's estate is divided between assets she controlled independently and those governed by the family trust established by her father. The trust specifically requires beneficiaries to be blood descendants of the Blackwell line. Which is precisely why we need to address Jennifer's situation," Douglas interrupted smoothly. "Recent information suggests she is not my biological daughter, and therefore has no claim to the Blackwell inheritance." A ripple of murmurs circulated around the table. James and I exchanged glances, our carefully rehearsed plan suddenly derailed by Douglas's preemptive strike. "I have DNA evidence," Douglas continued, sliding a folder toward Harrison, "confirming Jennifer is not my biological child. Under the bloodline requirement, she is ineligible for trust distribution." My heart pounded as Harrison reviewed the documents. We had anticipated raising the paternity issue ourselves, but Douglas had outmaneuvered us by presenting his own testing I had never consented to or provided samples for. "May I ask how you obtained my DNA for this test?" I asked, fighting to keep my voice level. Douglas's smile was cold. "From your water glass at our last family dinner. Quite simple, really." "That's illegal," James interjected. "Unauthorized DNA testing." "Irrelevant to the inheritance question," Harrison cut in. "The science is sound, regardless of collection methods." I felt our carefully constructed plan crumbling. If Harrison accepted Douglas's evidence while dismissing the legality of collection, we would lose our chance to reveal the truth on our terms. "I have additional evidence pertinent to the bloodline question," I said firmly, removing our own testing results from my bag. "DNA confirmation that James Blackwell is my biological father." The room erupted in shocked exclamations. Douglas's face contorted with fury as he turned on my mother, who met his gaze unflinchingly. "This changes nothing," Harrison insisted after reviewing our documentation. "The trust specifies Blackwell blood from Eleanor's direct line, which flows through her son Douglas to his legitimate heirs." It was the opening we needed. James stood slowly, commanding the room's attention. "I believe we need to examine the precise language of the trust," he said. "My understanding is that it requires beneficiaries to be blood descendants of Harold Blackwell, Eleanor's father. If that's the case, we have a significant problem." Harrison frowned. "What problem?" "Douglas is not biologically a Blackwell," James stated clearly. "He was adopted as an infant, a fact our parents kept private to protect him, but which Eleanor was aware of." The silence that followed was deafening. Douglas's face drained of color as he stared at his brother in naked shock. "That's absurd," he finally sputtered. "A desperate lie." "I have the adoption records," James continued implacably, "and DNA confirmation." He produced another folder. "If we're applying a strict bloodline test as Douglas insists, then I am Eleanor's only biological child, and Jennifer, as my biological daughter, is her only blood grandchild." Harrison looked stricken as he examined the documents, his loyalty to Douglas visibly warring with his professional obligations. "This is outrageous," Douglas shouted, rising from his chair. "I won't stand for this slander." You're the one who insisted only blood relatives deserve the Blackwell fortune, I reminded him quietly. Are you retracting that position now? Before Douglas could respond, the library doors opened to reveal a frail but determined Bernard Walsh, grandmother's personal attorney, leaning on a cane. I apologize for my tardiness, he said, nodding to me. I believe my presence is required for this reading. Harrison's dismay confirmed our suspicion. Bernard's unexpected recovery threatened whatever legal maneuvering Douglas had orchestrated in his absence. I would like to review the documents before proceeding, Bernard insisted, his experienced gaze already noting the tension filling the room. As Bernard settled at the table with the various test results and adoption papers spread before him, Douglas looked truly afraid for the first time. Whatever scheme he had constructed with Harrison was rapidly unraveling, but his desperation made him unpredictable and potentially dangerous. Bernard adjusted his reading glasses as he reviewed the final pages of grandmother's will, his voice steady and authoritative. Before addressing specific bequests, I must draw attention to a letter Eleanor Blackwell instructed me to read if questions of lineage arose during this proceeding. He opened a sealed envelope, the Blackwell crest embossed on heavy cream paper. The room fell silent as he began to read, "To my family gathered here. If this letter is being read, then the secret I have kept for decades has finally surfaced. I have always known that Douglas was not born of Blackwell blood, but was welcomed into our family through adoption, a noble act of love by my husband and myself after years of heartbreak. I have also known, since the moment I first held her, that Jennifer is James's biological daughter. A grandmother knows her own blood. The Blackwell Trust established by my father requires blood relation for principal inheritance. Having anticipated potential conflict, I have restructured my personal assets, which constitute the majority of what you now call the Blackwell fortune, to reflect my wishes rather than outdated notions of bloodline purity. To Douglas, you have been my son in every way that matters, but your treatment of Jennifer, your brother's child, has revealed a character that dishonors the Blackwell name you so jealously guard. By your own insistence on blood qualification, you have disqualified yourself from what you most covet." Bernard paused, looking directly at Douglas, whose face had gone ashen. "In accordance with Eleanor's explicit instructions," Bernard continued, "and in light of the DNA evidence presented today confirming both Douglas's adoption and Jennifer's parentage, the distribution is as follows. The trust assets requiring Blackwell bloodline pass to James Blackwell and his biological daughter, Jennifer. Eleanor's personal estate will be distributed according to the specific bequests outlined here." Douglas lunged for the documents, but Bernard calmly shifted them away. "You promised!" Douglas shouted at me, desperation breaking through his composed facade. "You said only blood relatives deserve the fortune." "No," I corrected him quietly. "You said that. I merely asked if you would keep your word about it. And you promised you would." The justice of this moment wasn't in the inheritance itself, but in watching Douglas's carefully constructed reality crumble under the weight of his own hypocrisy. The aftermath of the will reading unfolded like the final act of a Greek tragedy. Douglas, undone by his own machinations, stormed from the mansion shouting threats of legal challenges that everyone present knew would fail. Harrison Mills followed, his professional reputation in tatters after Bernard revealed his knowledge of the adoption records he had deliberately concealed. My brothers, stunned by the revelations, approached me uncertainly. Thomas, always the more sensitive of the two, spoke first. "I had no idea about any of this," he said quietly. "All those years, the way he treated you, it makes a terrible kind of sense now." William nodded soberly. "For what it's worth, you've always been our sister. That hasn't changed." Their sincerity moved me more than I expected. They had been shaped by Douglas too, in different ways. Perhaps there was a relationship worth salvaging there, given time. Mother approached next, relief and apprehension mingling in her expression. "I should have told you years ago," she said. "You were protecting me," I finished for her, I understand that now. The most profound conversation came later that evening, when James and I sat in grandmother's study, surrounded by the books and artifacts of a family history we were both rewriting in our minds. "What will you do now?" he asked, the weight of missed years heavy in his voice. "Build something new," I answered simply. "We can't recover the time we lost, but perhaps we can create something better going forward." He smiled, the expression so similar to my own that I wondered how I hadn't seen the resemblance before. I'd like that very much. As we talked into the night, sharing stories and discovering connections, I felt grandmother's presence in the room, her wisdom, her foresight, her absolute certainty that truth would eventually prevail. She had arranged everything perfectly, ensuring that justice would be served without requiring me to deliver it personally. In the end, Douglas's downfall came not from my actions, but from his own character revealed under pressure. He had spent decades ensuring I felt like an outsider in the family, never suspecting that he was the true outsider all along. The irony was perfect, and perfectly sufficient. As I looked toward the future, a future that included a father who actually wanted me in his life, I realized that was the greatest inheritance of all.